morning. It's good to see everyone this morning. Thank you, Mike. That's a good lead into what we'll talk about with what's coming up in the ag economy this year. Now, as everyone knows, we're in a little bit of a slump in the ag economy. We were riding pretty high a few years ago before the rest of the economy had recovered, and it's a little bit on the downside now. But you know, this too will pass. And so I was thinking about what I would talk about today, and I thought, you know, there's going to be a lot of leaders in this room. We have a lot of our agricultural leaders in this room today. So one of the things that might be appropriate for us to think about, maybe then rather than just focusing on the short term, is to think about what critical factors do we need to think about strategically for North Carolina agriculture. So I'd like to just pick out a few of those, and there's a lot. We won't just do a few today. The thing that I always start off ag presentations on North Carolina agriculture is how diverse our agriculture is. Even if you're an agricultural leader, you need to be reminded of this sometimes, because we are an incredibly diverse agriculture. And sometimes we also forget that about 68% of our agricultural income comes from the livestock and poultry sector. Well, kind of having this in mind then, what forces will be very important in shaping North Carolina's agricultural future? Well, obviously one is demand for food. We've heard a lot of talk over the last 5 to 10 years about how the global population's growth is going to increase demand for food, but I think in order to make that fact useful for us in North Carolina, we need to drill down a little bit further, and we'll do that. Consumer trends, and some of those will have big impacts on some of our agricultural sectors here in North Carolina. Structural change in agricultural suppliers and customers, and we're seeing tremendous change on both the customer side and the supplier side right now. And then, of course, as Dr. Walden alluded to a few minutes ago, the urban-rural interface and where the growth is occurring in North Carolina. On the government regulatory side, the Farm Bill, obviously, and we say, well, that's short-term. Well, we hope so, but sometimes it ends up being long-term. So we'll see, right? Labor. Huge issue for us here in North Carolina, and there's a lot of things going on right now in that area. FDA regulation, and it's not just tobacco, and if you want to hear more about the tobacco, come back tomorrow to the tobacco board's meeting. And of course, trade agreements, as Mike has alluded to. So let's talk a little bit about some of these. Demand for food. One of the ones I want to focus here on is the one that Dr. Walden mentioned, is global meat consumption. If you look at how global meat consumption per capita is increasing, it's increasing rapidly, not only in developing countries, and we see there as people get more income, as Mike said, they want to eat better and they want to include more meat in their diet. It's also increasing in industrialized countries as well. It has not plateaued off there either. And so opportunities exist. Now, in a lot of the developing countries, we see them developing tremendous capacity to grow the meat themselves. China is a good example. Their integrated pork and poultry industry is growing rapidly, and so a lot of that demand will be manifested in demand for feedstuffs for that industry. In industrialized countries, though, like Japan, there are very tremendous opportunities, I think, for us to export more meat to them directly. Now, exceptions do exist to what I mentioned, and I'm going to talk about these in a minute, is Mexico, for example, which may not be in the industrialized country sector, but they are a major, major customer for our pork industry. And right here is just an example of that. If you look at the customers for U.S. our pork exports, and we are a major supplier of pork here in the U.S., you'll see that Mexico is the biggest customer. Keep that in mind, because when we start talking about the impact of trade and trade agreements, that's a very important fact to keep in mind. Japan is the second largest customer. You know, we're in negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership last year and the year before, and while there were some big concerns about that for tobacco, there were also tremendous opportunities for meat exports to Japan, so it has big impacts. Okay, we got to think about our competition too. It's not just about us, it's about what's happening elsewhere in the world. And sometimes we don't think about Africa. Now, those of us that work in the tobacco sector do think about Africa sometimes, because Zimbabwe is an important competitor. But one of the things that's happening there is, despite the lack of infrastructure and despite some problems with many of the governments there, we see the Chinese going in and being very successful at developing agricultural resources for their own market. So in a roundabout way, that is competition to us, even if that's going directly to China, because we want part of that China market, correct? Australia. Australia is not a huge agricultural producer in the world market, but they're a very significant one. I had the opportunity to be in Australia earlier this fall, and everywhere you went, they talked about the fact that they were within reach of almost half the world's population. And Australia does some things very well, and one of those things they do very well is meat production. They produce huge numbers of cattle. They do a lot of live cattle exports to Indonesia and Malaysia. They also are targeting that Japan market, which I mentioned was one of the potential markets for us. And of course, the Chinese and the Indian markets as well are big markets for them. So it's not only livestock and poultry, but also fresh produce, because they're within arm's reach of that. So I can tell you they're very happy that the U.S. is no longer in the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, because it opens up that market even more for them to take advantage of those opportunities within their sphere. Well, here's the big one though. Many of y'all have been to Brazil. We take farmers to Brazil on a regular basis. Brazil has tremendous agricultural productivity and capacity, and they're increasing that rapidly. I can tell you, if the Brazilian government could get its game in line, and if they could develop adequate infrastructure for their farmers, it would really be scary, because they have very innovative farmers there who many times don't have the opportunities and the benefit of the infrastructure and the government help that we have here in the U.S., and despite that, they're still extremely competitive. And soybeans, of course, is the story you probably know about. They're the world's largest soybean exporter and producer, and they have surpassed us in terms of exports of soybeans and production in recent years. We're close behind them. Now, that's not as important perhaps for North Carolina, although we produce a lot of soybeans, but some of the other things are critically important. Did you know that Brazil was a large producer of poultry in the world market? And you can see that China's third. Well, China consumes all theirs. We're a big poultry exporter, and Brazil is a big poultry exporter too. And it's not backyard chickens. They have an integrated hog and poultry industry just like we do that's very sophisticated. And they are looking to export that poultry and hogs to a lot of the same markets that we target. And you know, I mentioned Mexico. Remember, Brazil would love to be their major exporter of pork and poultry too, and they're not that much further than we are away from it. So we have to keep that competition in mind when we're looking forward. Just to give you an example, the Cerrado Plain, and go look that up if you're not familiar with it, has over 100 million head. I've noticed this. This is a Brazilian slide from one of the fellows I know in Brazil, grass-fed cattle. Isn't that the big thing we talk about? Well, their cattle have always been grass-fed because that's all they had to feed them in the Cerrado Plain, and that's what they do. But now they're using that as a marketing ploy. Now, you think, well, they're chopping down the Amazon rainforest, right, to do this, and so that's a really bad thing, and so the world's going to convince them not to do that. Well, no, that's not really the case. Yes, they may be clearing some Amazon rainforest, but the Cerrado Plain, which has no forest in it at all, is basically scrub brush that the Brazilians have learned how to farm in the last 40 years, and where they have learned how to turn land that was basically wasteland into productive farmland. There's over 80 million acres of degraded pasture that could be turned into this farmland like they use to grow the soybeans. That's the breadbasket of the world. And when you go there and you look at that soil, you think, wow, how in the world could you produce anything on this? But the truth is they figured out how to do that, and there's still 80 to 100 million acres of that left that doesn't require any deforestation. It just requires clearing and using modern farming techniques. So we have to keep an eye on Brazil. The biggest impediment they have is their own government and their own lack of infrastructure. Okay, consumer food trends. This is a little bit of a hard slide to read, so I'm going to show it to you differently in just a minute. But this is from a consulting company called CCD Innovation, and they identify some of the top consumer food trends here in the U.S., and some of them are very significant for us here in North Carolina. Let me just show them to you in a little bit plainer fashion so they're easy to read. Culinary culture. You say, what in the world? Well, have any of you heard of Blue Apron or HelloFresh, or do you watch all the cooking shows? Americans, particularly those with adequate incomes and higher education levels, are enamored with culinary trends. They like the fact that they can get fresh food. My wife ordered a packet from HelloFresh the other week, and I've always eaten fresh food, local food, because I grew up on a small farm in western North Carolina. We just didn't know that's what it was, right? But this is a big trend. She wanted to see what they had. She loves to cook, and she wanted to see what they had packaged. They send you a recipe. They tell you how to prepare it. They do the whole thing. It's a culinary experience for the family, and they make it accessible and easy for the family to do in about 30 minutes for the busy family. This is a growing trend. It's one that we can latch onto in North Carolina, particularly in our produce and sweet potato industry, where it fits right in that niche. And perhaps our other meat industries as well can fit in there. But it's one that we ought to latch into because it's a value-added sector, and it's also one that sometimes at the farm level, especially for some of our produce and sweet potato farms, that we can kind of move into that value-added sector rather than just selling into the general market. Source. This is one that's grown specifically out of the local food movement. When you drill down to the local food movement, one of the things that people really like about that and want about that is they know the story behind their food. They know the source of it. And there's a segment of our customer population that wants to know where their food comes. They want to know the story about the farmer. And we see that moving beyond local food, and we see that blurring the lines of what we traditionally thought of as local food. And everybody wants to be local now. Everybody wants to tell the story, whether it's Amazon Fresh or whether it's Walmart. The last one is nutrition. Consumers want to know what they eat. They want to know the nutritional value of it. And food companies are latching onto this too because they realize that by labeling and describing the nutritional value of their food to the consumer, that adds value to that consumer. And so again, in many of our sectors in North Carolina, we can latch on to these trends. And we are very fortunate. If you do a Google of superfoods on the internet, you're going to see some North Carolina commodities come up there. Blueberries, one of the top superfoods, it's almost always in the list. Kale, collard, spinach, cabbages, broccoli. You say, well, we don't produce that much in North Carolina. Well, we don't produce a huge amount, but actually it's an important niche that our produce industry in eastern North Carolina in particular occupies in the East Coast produce from north-south to north, movement in the season. And then, of course, sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes almost always come up in this search of the top 10 superfoods. This is a way that we can add value, and I think our sweet potato producers, our packer processors are doing a really good job of taking advantage of this trend and marketing a product that is really a star right now in the market. And there you see that. You can see how sweet potato consumption is increasing. And it's not just here, it's in Europe, and I think there are other potential markets around the world. Peter Thornton and I were just talking about that, about what potential there is in other markets to latch on to this. Structural change. This is a really big issue in agriculture. Ag suppliers. We see mergers or acquisitions like Bayer buying Monsanto, Syngenta being sold to a Chinese supplier. Yes, there is an argument for increased efficiency. It also increases market power. So there are valid concerns, and there is research that's showing that this could impact R&D, perhaps not in a positive way, maybe, this is a debatable point, and also could impact seed prices for farmers, so we need to keep a watch on this. Trends in retail grocery, man, this one is a big, big change area. You see Amazon moving very aggressively into this market with the purchase of Whole Foods. Amazon Fresh had a farmer group where we were on a conference call with the head of Amazon Fresh a couple of months ago. Enlightening to see their philosophy of how they're aggressively pursuing this market and trying to take advantage of these consumer trends. Walmart's trying to be there. There's going to be a lot of blood on the floor, as some people say, before this fight among grocers gets over. You see big change in this retail sector. So if you're a packer processor, if you're somebody selling into this retail sector from North Carolina, you need to pay very, very close attention to the changes in the grocery sector. Okay. Urban-rural interface. I won't say a whole lot about this one in lieu of time, but this one is a very critical area as well. How can agriculture in these areas where we're seeing population loss take advantage of this trend and perhaps become, if it's not already, and in many cases it is, the prime economic driver to maintain some of these very rural economies that are losing population? And as well, we do have urban growth affecting some of our major ag production areas like Sampson and Dukeland and Wayne and Johnston, where urban growth is encroaching. How do we balance that? So that has real policy implications as well as market implications. Yes, it takes away farmland, and farmers have kind of a struggle here because it also increases their net worth. So there's these two offsetting effects when that happens. Okay, let me very quickly finish up by just touching very quickly on some of the government and regulatory forces because they have big, big effects. The Farm Bill. There's a lot of discussion now about the Farm Bill. The House is trying to get their version out. There's going to be some significant changes as that comes out. I don't think the Senate's really got very far on theirs. Will it get done in 2018? I don't know, probably not. The commissioner shakes his hand and he's probably exactly right. It's probably going to take more time than that. It's going to be a lot of wrangling. The last Farm Bill was done in a period of very high prices. And when they set those reference prices for corn and soybeans and cotton, not cotton, but other commodities, they set them fairly high and felt pretty good about it because the prices were high. Well, now we're in a very different environment. Commodity prices are very low. And so now you got a lot of debate. Well, maybe we set them too high, they say. And so maybe we need to rethink where they're going to be. There's a lot of budget pressure to reduce expenses under the Farm Bill. And yes, the actual farm part of it's only 20% of it, but it comes under a lot of scrutiny. 80%, by the way, is SNAP. Crop insurance is a major part of the Farm Bill. If you hear Congressman Conaway, he'll say this is a major foundational part of the Farm Bill. I don't think anybody debates that. The debate's going to be about how much money are we going to spend to provide help with the premiums, and they're going to talk about subsidies, and they're going to say help. Cotton, we're going to see, we are seeing efforts to resurrect some sort of cotton program that looks more like corn and soybeans. I think that's probably going to happen. It's going to be a big area of debate. The dairy program is going to be another one that they look at and trying to make some changes to. Labor, I mentioned, huge issue for us. Our adverse wage rate for H-2A labor this year is going to be 11.46. Will there be labor reform? I don't know. There are opportunities this year, and if immigration reform, as Dr. Walden mentioned, goes forward, then perhaps there still are some opportunities for something like H-2C, or at least some improvements to be made. We'll have to watch and see, but it's critically important for a state like North Carolina, where we are so dependent on labor for these high-value, labor-intensive crops. Okay, FDA regulation, it's not just tip, sack, and tobacco, it's also the Food Safety Modernization Act. You say, well, yeah, that passed a long time ago. Aren't they have that implemented? No, it's just beginning to be implemented. In fact, the Food Produce Safety Rule just this year is going to come into force for large farms. Now, most of our larger farms are in really good shape because many of our farms are EuroGAP certified, so they're already there, way beyond some of this. Small farms, it's a little more difficult. And of course, tobacco. If you watched the news, you saw last week where the Tobacco Products Advisory Committee, they had a hearing with Philip Morris's new Heat Not Burn product. Some real questions there. It's going to be a slow process, I think, but it's one that has big impacts for us here in North Carolina. Okay, let me finish up with just saying a word about trade. Critically important. If you go back to my slide where I talked about global meat demand, remember that Mexico was our biggest customer for pork. Well, if you take away preferential treatment for the U.S. and Mexico, guess who's standing at the gate waiting to get into that market and take your market share? Remember my slide about Brazil? They are waiting, and they're not that far away. They're pretty close too. They might not be right across the border, but they can get ships there really, really quick. So let me tell you, it's critically important for North Carolina. If you look at cotton, everybody thinks China is the only big customer. No, Mexico is a huge customer. Central America is a huge customer for cotton going into there for textile manufacturing. And of course, tobacco is an export product, very important. We heard that raised and talked about in the Trans-Pacific Pact negotiations last year. But pork and chicken are huge. We're big exporters of pork and chicken to developing countries. I was surprised in sitting at a dinner with some transatlantic ocean carriers, a refrigerated product a couple of years ago, and they were talking about shipping North Carolina chicken, frozen chicken, to the Congo. And I'm like, really? The Congo can buy our chicken? They, oh yeah, they buy a lot of it. I had no idea. And so these are important markets for us. And here's just a slide from Peter Thornton from NCDA that shows you the importance of NAFTA and how much of our product is going in there. And you'll see that it's timber and meat are the two biggest products, and following that are some of our processed food, and of course there are other products as well. Well, what do these all impact? They clearly impact innovation at the farm level, right? Particularly some of the mergers and structural change that we see going on. They impact value added at the farm because some of these things, consumer trends and the changes in demand for food, open up opportunities for value added and innovative folks like we have in North Carolina, and obviously the sustainability and profitability of our ag sector. We have a very vibrant agriculture. It's going to change the face of rural North Carolina, and we have innovative folks who hopefully can take advantage of some of these opportunities and work hard to also mitigate some of the threats. So with that, I will stop, and thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. Good to be with you.